Greetings, I'm Rich Rhoda, and this interview is part of the Tennessee Board of Regents Oral History Project. Today is September 25th, 2018, and I'm very pleased to be with Mr. Ben Kimbrough today. Mr. Kimbrough was a charter member of the Tennessee Board of Regents, which was created in 1972 by the Tennessee General Assembly. Of note, he was the first vice chair of the board and served in that capacity for 3 years. I would note that the enabling legislation of the Board of Regents provided that the governor of the state of Tennessee is the appointing authority for the board as well as a voting member. Traditionally, the board elects the governor as the chair of the board. The vice chair, however, is the senior lay member of the board who presides in the absence of the chair. So consequently, the vice chair is the board leader. I should also note that Mr. Kimbrough had a tremendous career in the banking industry. He retired as vice chairman of the Bank of America, Tennessee. He was a tremendous civic leader here in his hometown of Clarksville, Tennessee, a leader of many philanthropic and educational organizations, and a major supporter of those organizations, including his alma mater, Austin Peay State University, which is where we are today. And we are right next door to the Kimbrough Business Building. Another distinction, which we'll talk about in a bit, Mr. Kimbrough served as a member of the UT Board of Trustees and also served as the vice chair. He was a founding member of the UT Foundation as well. So, Ben, thank you for being here.
Thank you. I'm glad to be with you, Rich.
So we will just start talking about primarily your experience as the vice chair of the Board of Regents. And I've got to ask, because it was a brand new board at the time, 1972, where did you actually get engaged in the discussions as well as then your appointments?
Well, actually, I had served here in Montgomery County and in Clarksville on the local school board. And I chaired the commission that the county and city set up to consolidate the two school systems in Montgomery County. And we were one of the few in the state that have a consolidated city-county school system. So I chaired that commission in 1963, and then I went on that board and served as chairman of that board, incidentally with Senator Harville, who was my mentor and a member of my bank board, and of course was president of Austin Peay State University at the time, and he went on to become a long-term state senator from this particular senatorial district. So that was sort of my background in education. My real background, of course, was in banking. That's what my father organized the bank that we had here in Clarksville in 1906. He died in 1959, and I became president, so I really was in the banking business. Then I went to Nashville as vice chairman of Commerce Union Bank, and then through a lot of mergers as a member of the board of Bank of America, Tennessee.
Right. So when it actually came time, and my understanding was there is the creation of the Board of Regents was not a one-time idea that was enacted initially. There was a long build-up within at least the higher education ranks and the campuses.
Well, I think the history of the Board of Regents could evolve because of the political situation in higher education in Tennessee. The University of Tennessee Board of Trustees traditionally was a monolithic organization that had a lot of clout with the legislature all over the state because they were in every county in the agricultural part of it. And so they had a presence in all the 95 counties of Tennessee, and they really controlled the funding process for higher education through the legislature. And each individual members of each individual university and college in the state that were independent, like Austin Peay and the University of Memphis State and East Tennessee, all of those people had to go to the legislature to get their own funding, and they had to lobby the legislature, and there was just a simple pool of money. And I think that the real idea was that if they were going to have any real clout in the legislature, that they would have to be bond together and become a single unit that could be equal to the University of Tennessee in its prowess with the legislature. I think that's really that really was the guiding thing that got it going.
Right. And so if I remember, so the universities like Austin P and East Tennessee and Middle, whatever, were under the State Board of Education.
That's right.
But in reality, it was what you just described, where they really did not have that.
The local communities in which these colleges resided had to really do a lot of lobbying with their legislators and trying to bargain off with each other for the funding. It was not a very happy way to be funded, to be honest with you.
Yeah, well, that's what I understand. So Winfield Dunn was elected governor in '70, I guess, and there was a study. There have been a series of studies about a different governance structure, but as a result of all that, the Board of Regents, as it was
actually authorized and came into being in 1972, 2 years into Winfield's term, actually. And of course, it created a lot of tensions in and of itself, because the State Board of Education lost the control of these universities. And that control then became a part of the new Board of Regents system.
Right.
And actually, good many of these college presidents had a lot to do with getting it set up. And C.C. Humphreys, Sonny Humphreys in Memphis, was president of Memphis State, and he became the first chancellor of the university, of the Board of Regents system. And as such, he worked awfully hard to get it underway, because it was a brand new entity with a lot of tensions in it from one end of the state to the other. It's closer to Canada in Johnson City than it is to Memphis. So that's how we were. I knew that because we had branches in both places,
Right.
bike branches.
Yeah, well, I remember that became a big issue with the call for a new med school.
That's exactly
And,
right.
Right. So of the original board members who were appointed by Governor Dunn, were they all, were you known, did you know one another?
I did not know them. In fact, I don't know that I knew any of them. I knew of some of them, but I did not know them. Winfield, of course, you had a democratically controlled legislature and a Republican governor. And you had people like Howard Wolf, who at the time was head of the Board of Education. He was the chairman of the board, the Commission of Education at the time Winfield came into office. Of course, he did not remain as commissioner, but he had a lot of political power in the legislature, and so there was a trade-off between who the appointees were. There were a certain number of people that that you might say were Republicans, and a certain number of Democrats, and that was a trade-off with the fact that the legislature was of one party and the governor another. I was a Republican appointee. Ken Ezel in Murfreesboro was a Republican appointee. Bud Elana in Athens was a Republican appointee, as was our friend down in Memphis was, what was that boy's name?
George Klepper was from Memphis.
George Klepper. He was one of Winfield's appointees. And then Howard Wolf and several appointees over the state were people that the legislature had recommended. So we had a very diverse board. Winfield had control of it about 8 to 7, I think that's because he had his constitutional officers as voting members. That was the Commission of Education and the Commission of Agriculture. They were both, and the chairman of the Higher Education Commission was also a member of our board.
Right.
And that was the makeup of it.
Yeah.
Pretty sizable group of people.
Yeah, and so the ex officio members were just that, but the others, you had said earlier, originally was 9-year terms.
There were 9-year terms originally. Of course, the UT board and the Board of Regents both had 9-year terms. later reduced to 6-year terms. The idea being that you wanted these terms to supersede any particular governor, and that's the way it is now.
Yeah, and that time, initially, governors could only serve one 4-year
One
term.
4-year term was all a governor could serve, and they'd just recently been raised from 2 years to 4 years.
Yep. Okay, so back to who some of the key figures were kind of around that. So Dr. Humphreys was the first.
He was the first chancellor.
The university presidents who were in place at the time, I always thought of them kind of as the titan.
Well, here at Austin Peay was Joe Morgan, and I tell you, I really don't remember all of them. I've forgotten who was at Murfreesboro.
Mel Scarlett.
That's right, Mel Scarlett was there.
And Everett Derryberry, who had been at Tennessee Tech for a long number of years. Andrew Torrance was at TSU, and we need to talk about that in a minute. And East Tennessee State was Dr. Culp, D.P. Culp.
That's right. All of these people had been, not all of them were in place at the time of the Board of Regents was, well, maybe they all were in place, but there was a turnover pretty quickly with some of them.
Right. Well, of course, Dr. Humphreys, when he came. Yeah. Any of the community college presidents?
I don't remember too many of them. I'm not even sure did we have 10 or 8 community colleges at the time of the incidence of the board, or even 6, I don't remember.
Yeah, I think it was actually more like 6, but they were in waves.
Yeah.
So it would eventually be 10.
Came to 10.
Yeah.
But that was one of the problems with the Board of Regents, and I think it remained a problem until we've had this recent changes, and that is you had too many people for a single board to actually oversee. You had the community colleges, you had the technical institutes, and you had the 6 4-year universities. That's just too much. You couldn't. There's no one board could really oversee it, and so I think they did the right thing in finally removing the technical schools and the community colleges, and they got into a different situation.
Right. So we touched briefly about UT and the dynamics there, but who were some of the leaders that you?
Well, the UT, you mean at the University of Tennessee?
Yeah.
Well, of course, Ed Bowling was president of the University of Tennessee, and Joe Johnson was executive vice president, and it was a very closely controlled system. Of course, you had a satellite system in Martin. You had UT Martin. You had UT Chattanooga. And you had the medical units in Memphis and the campus at Knoxville. But basically, the president of the system was the top dog in that system.
Yeah. Do you know Andy Holt?
Well, Andy, of course, I knew Andy, but only after he had retired from the university president. Ed Bowling and I were very close friends, and both socially and in the higher education situation, and Ed was president when from all the time I really had much knowledge of the University of Tennessee system.
Right. So as far as actually setting up the new system, do you recall who? I mean, did you have a blueprint? Were you?
Well, not really. I think that Cecil Humphreys had a lot of ideas, and of course he discussed many things with the board, but we sort of felt our way along in the beginning months, certainly. I'd say the beginning years of it. It didn't mature for 10 years probably? I was long off of it when it matured.
Yeah. Well, I think, and appreciate your thoughts on this too, but Dr. Humphreys was great. He brought, the bearing of a titan of higher education. And then, of course, he left pretty quickly, but then Roy Nix came in.
Yeah.
And he actually came in from the UT system.
That's right.
But that's when I think his early years of him being chancellor, and I think he's the longest serving chancellor, a lot of the policies and procedures that set up kind of the decentralized approach. I think at one point you referred to the system as a confederation of, but that's where but I always wondered whether there was a model that somebody was was playing out, or whether it was, as you said, kind of.
Well, Roy did a great job, I thought, and as you say, he was the longest serving chancellor. And how many years was Roy chancellor? Do you
16. I'll find out.
No,
we'll get that on the record.
No,
well, I think he started in 75 and left in 86, so 11 years.
See, I went off the board in. I was appointed in 72, and I went off and I had appointed to a 4-year term, so I went off in 76. See, the initial members were allotted different from 1 year to the full 9-year term. They were not were sort of a drawing lots
Staggered,
situation.
yeah. So not everybody would turn over.
So my original term was 4 years, and I was not reappointed because Ray Blanton was not on the same political tune that I was on.
Right. Well, I know this is kind of jumping ahead chronologically, but so then you did soon after that, you were appointed to the UT board.
Yeah, well, not until 78, because, early 79, because when Lamar was elected in 1978 as governor, and he asked me to serve on the UT board, which I agreed to do, and I filled an unexpired term in this particular congressional district, and then was appointed for the full 9-year term later. So I served on the UT board, I guess, 12 years.
Right, and I think you have the distinction of being the only person to serve on both the Board of Regents.
I'm the only appointed person that ever served on both the Board of Regents and the UT board. Of course, the constitutional officers, some of them served on both boards, but because by that's the way the laws was set up. But from a lay person, I'm the only person who's ever served on both of them.
That's a distinction.
Well, I don't know whether
it's not for the faint-hearted.
Self-flagellation, I guess.
Yeah, right. So a couple of the big issues during those early years of the Board of Regents, the ones that come to mind are the ETSU College of Medicine.
That's probably the most contentious thing that we had in the beginning, because Winfield Dunn, as governor and as a member of our Board of Regents, was unalterably opposed to another medical school. He was afraid that having 2 medical schools in Tennessee, that there would not be sufficient funding to have 2 good medical schools. That was his whole argument. Mm-hmm. He was fearful all the time that if you had another medical school in the state that had to go to the legislature for its funding, that you would end up with less funding for either one of them, and that neither one would be the kind of medical school that he felt was the state ought to have. But on the other hand, the people in the 1st District, particularly in Johnson City, those people who were his real political allies and everything else were determined to have a medical school closer to themselves in Memphis. And so it became a very contentious issue, and it boiled down to the board voting whether or not to authorize a medical school at East Tennessee State University. I remember the vote quite well because it was carried by Winfield's members, I think 9-8 or whatever it was. It was just about it was, the medical school was defeated, but that wasn't the end of it. They had enough clout in the legislature that the legislature overrode the board and authorized that school. And I think it's been a very successful school. I think the fears that Winfield had probably were not realized.
Right. Well, he has written about that in his book, and exactly the way he stated it. So, yeah, he vetoed the legislation, and then the veto was overridden.
Right. After they passed it in the legislature, he vetoed it. But in Tennessee, that doesn't mean anything. You can override a governor's veto with 1 vote. So that's what they did.
Yeah. So another area contentious was the desegregation lawsuit, of which Tennessee State was the as the federal judge, Tom Wiseman, said, TSU was the central figure in the lawsuit.
That's
I
right.
know you had some issues. We all had issues.
Well, I remember it awfully well because that was the issue that removed the University of Tennessee, for all practical purposes, from the Nashville area, and gave their apparatus really to TSU, and it was not. I don't remember it being a contentious issue in the Board of Regents. It was a contentious issue politically in the state and through the federal courts. But once UT was removed from there, then you ended up with the Board of Regents having to upgrade more than it had been upgraded, the Tennessee State presence in Nashville and in Davidson County.
Yeah, and that lawsuit and that went on, and I think it ended in the early 2000s. So
That's right.
It was, it was a long time coming, because I think it started in the late 60s, even before the Board of Regents.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, it had been in the pipeline for 10 years, I guess. Isn't that about right?
Oh yeah, I
At
think
least
you're
that
exactly
long.
right. Yeah, and there was a change in presidency early on in that. So,
But
the board.
But that was an issue that we really were not involved with, except that we were, in an ancillary fashion, had to take charge of it once it had happened, once the federal courts had ruled.
Yep. Well, it was all part of the early days of the system, and
That's right. Right.
yeah.
And it happened while the Board of Regents was just becoming operative, really.
I agree. Yeah. So, what else did I ask you about?
Well, I don't know. I think you talk about contentious issues. I remember mighty well that we had some very contentious issues. They had racial overtones, and I was having to preside at some of those meetings. I remember particularly when we were choosing a president for TSU in Nashville, and we were meeting on the campus there, and both of the candidates, one was a female African American, and the other one was a male African American, and the Board of Regents was having to make a choice. And I remember that it was a pretty contentious meeting. It lasted a long time. It had to be, if I recall correctly, it had to be adjourned and then reconstituted before we ever finally came to a vote on it. But you had proponents of both candidates lining the walls and chanting and doing everything. It was not easy to keep order, but I remember we finally got through it, and we chose the male candidate as the president of TSU. Do you remember all about that?
Well, bits and pieces, but yeah, that would have been 1975.
Yeah.
And Roy Nix was a relatively new chancellor, but yeah, that was and then it was right after that well, I shouldn't say right after, but the court order merger of UT Nashville and TSU.
That's
so it was
right.
just kind of a rolling.
It's kind of
set
a
of
rolling
characters.
thing. That's right.
Yeah.
Well, actually, asked me if I can remember anything else. I remember the fact that the board actually operated, I thought, very, very cohesively, to have the personalities that were all on it, because several of the personalities had issues of their own. Most of us who were lay people didn't. We came to the thing with no knowledge of past problems and past animosities or anything else. But I thought the board acted as a unit on most occasions, and really did a good job. And then, of course, matured later on, after I was no longer on it. It really matured. And I think all those things disappeared with a lot of people that had issues were no longer on the Board of Regents, and you had a totally new complexion. And I really think, though, that the board had worked fine. Now that it's been I wouldn't call it decommissioned, but almost decommissioned. It's not. It'll be interesting to see how it fulfills its present role, because it's a different role now than it was initially constituted.
Yeah, well, a different model, and this was the,
Yeah, that's right.
the Focus Act of.
There are a lot of things now with these local boards for the universities that are pluses. I think that you get some people that are willing to give time and effort and money to their local universities, and really, I just hope they don't break apart as you know. There's just a single pool of students, and with all the universities vying for those same students, you spend a lot of money sometime that could be spent more in the matriculation process in the universities than it would be in trying to grab students from each other. Since I felt like that has always been a mistake.
Yeah, well, to your point, so we have this statewide initiative to increase educational attainment, the Drive to 55.
Right.
And so the idea is to better educate more people, not go after the same people. And this university, as we were talking earlier, really has a more diverse student population than it once did with older students.
Oh, you know, this university with 10,500, nearly 11,000 students in it, it's very non-traditional. You've got a lot of retired military people that continue their education here and get it and get their degrees here. And I've got a lady that comes to cook for me and will clean for me, and she's a retired military person from the National Guard in Nashville, in active duty for 4 years, and she's got grown children, but she's finishing up her degree in May at Austin Peay because she just wants the degree. I said, what are you going to share? What are you going to do with it once you get it? She said, I don't know that I'm going to do anything with it, but I'm determined that I'm going to have my BS degree.
That's
and so some of it's online, but most of it's over here. And so in May, she'll undoubtedly receive a degree. And I said, well, you can remember that you couldn't use it over in Afghanistan or Iraq when you were deployed, but but it's those kinds of non-traditional students make up a part of this university, probably far more than they would at Murfreesboro or certainly at East Tennessee or Tennessee Tech. But it's a huge economic engine in this county, it really is.
Right. Well, and I think, you know, the concept of spinning off the former universities of the Board of Regents was this is the time to be entrepreneurial, might have to be more sensitive to the unique nature of those they serve. So we'll be optimistic.
You got any more questions?
I think that's it for me, but boy, this has been wonderful.
Well, I don't
Thank
know
you so
that
much.
It's been wonderful. I think back on it, it was certainly an interesting part of my life and career. Now that I'm past 90 years old and looking back on those years, that's 46 years ago that we're talking about. It's hard to remember everybody's name and everything, but I remember some of the issues quite vividly.
Yeah, I could tell. That's great. Well, thank you, Ben.
Okay, thank you.
Right. We're through.